Today I'm going to be sharing what I read in October and November. For some reason I decided to read a bunch of sad shit in the past 2 months, so that was a lot of fun. So this wrap up probably won't be very funny. A lot of these books do deal with very serious topics, so I'm putting trigger warnings for the books that I think need it, so please read those if you're considering reading the books I'm talking about. Okay, so in my last wrap up I was talking about Gone Girl by Gillian Flynn, and now I've read Sharp Objects by Gillian Flynn. I think this was her debut novel. I do think I like Gone Girl a little bit better, maybe because I think I got into it quicker, and it was also like less depressing, I think. Sharp Objects is about a girl named Camille. She's, I think, like early 30s, I'm gonna say. She is a reporter. Her boss asks her to go back to her small little hometown in Missouri to investigate the recent murders of 2 young girls that happened in her town. She's dealing with a lot of mental issues herself and a lot of issues surrounding that town and her childhood. So she goes back and she investigates, and things happen. I really liked it, which is interesting because I'm a very like character-driven reader. Like if I don't like the characters, it's really hard for me to get into it. And I basically hated every character except Camille's boss and the boss's wife, and so it was very interesting that I liked it so much, but I really did like it. And then I saw the Hulu miniseries, and that blew me away. I think I liked that better than the book. I know that's controversial, but I thought it was amazing. There are things you can just do visually with a story like that that you just can't do in a book as well, I guess, and I just absolutely loved it. And I think I like the main character way more in the series and in the show, probably because Amy Adams plays her and she's an absolute queen. And it was so weird seeing her do such a serious role like that, but she was incredible. I think the book really lends itself to a miniseries like that, especially with all the visuals. The miniseries was very loyal to the book, but it did make it its own with all the visuals. Like for instance, there was a bunch of flashbacks, like flashes from past and present in the show that they just, can't really do in a book, and that was so good. They gave extra time to certain characters and to certain plot lines because they did have the time, because it was a TV series. Even though I went into it being like similar to how I went into the Gone Girl movie, where I was like, is it going to be as interesting because I do know what happens, like I know the mystery, so will it be as good? Yes, it was. It was so good, and what kept me so fascinated was because I didn't know how they were going to handle certain plot points or what they were going to do with it. So seeing how they did that and how they revealed certain things was so cool. How they did the big end reveal was very different from the book, and yet I felt so much more captivating and satisfying and so much more like eerie and intriguing. I loved it. Now that I've read 2 Gillian Flynn books, I can really tell that her niche is just really exposing like the worst, darkest parts of humanity, and she really likes complex, tortured, I guess, female characters, and she's very into small town life and finding the darkest parts of that whole thing. But it was really good, and I'm definitely happy I read it, and I'm especially happy that I watched the series. Even if you haven't read the book, watch the series because it is so good, and Amy Adams is incredible. Okay, so the next book I read was Queen of Nothing by Holly Black. It's the last book in the Folk of Air series, and it was good. It was a good wrap-up. I really like the world building in this series, and I like the characters. It was very middle of the road for me though. Like I don't have any really strong feelings about the series, which is interesting because I usually get very emotionally invested into YA fantasy series, and this was like the first one that I was just sort of like, okay, this was good. Maybe because it felt very far removed from reality, even more so than other fantasy series that I know, because it is set in its own world. There are times that they go into the human world, but even then, like, I don't know, maybe that's why I just didn't get as invested, because it felt very, I guess, just very different. But it was entertaining. It was a solid last book. I thought it wrapped up the series really well. Things that I wanted to see happened, and it was pretty good. The next book I read was In the Dream House by Carmen Maria Machado. This is a memoir about the author's experience in an abusive same-sex relationship. I find it very hard to sort of try to discuss the quality of a memoir like this about just somebody else's trauma, but you can really tell that she's a writer and she studied writing, because this was an absolutely incredible story, not in terms of like content, but in terms of just the writing style. It's just really well done. The writing style was super thought-provoking and beautiful, and this whole atmospheric symbolism of this dream house was very well crafted. The whole book is essentially just one big setting symbol of this dream house where bad things happen to her throughout her life in this toxic, abusive relationship. I like really had to use my brain while reading this. Like, I felt like I had to tap into that academic part of my brain that I haven't really used in a hot minute to sort of try to get and understand and analyze all this symbolism she was using. She uses a lot of figurative language, a lot of analogies, a lot of metaphors, and you sort of just have to try to keep up. I liked it because it was a good challenge, and it forced me, which I think was maybe part of the intention, but it forced me to sort of pause and really think about the content and the messaging that I was getting. And it lends itself to the story because the author really wants us to confront our own preconceptions of what an abusive relationship looks like, who do we think of as survivors, who do we think of as perpetrators in our head demographically, I guess. But the whole time I was like, should I start annotating for an in-class essay for AP Lit? Ugh. But it was so heartbreaking, but it was a beautiful read, and definitely glad I read it. Okay, the next book I read was Heartstopper Volume 2 by Alice Oseman. This one was a little break from all the sad. It was just pure serotonin. This is the second book in the Heartstopper series, which is Alice Oseman's YA graphic novel, male-male romance about Nick and Charlie. It starts immediately where the last chapter left off, and it was just so sweet. It was so nice. It did call me single in at least 58 different ways and made me want to die of loneliness, but other than that, it was pretty good. Just so sweet. Their relationship is incredible. It's basically just more about their relationship, and especially about Nick and him trying to come to terms with his sexuality, understand it a little bit, his coming out story. I think this is just such a good, healthy example of what to do, or what you can or should do if your partner is not yet out of the closet or is struggling with their sexuality. I think their communication is fantastic, and they're just so supportive of one another, and I love that. I was just so impressed by both characters in this and their growth. I want to protect them at all costs, and I cannot wait for the next book. It was so cute. Okay, the last book I want to talk about is Where the Crawdads Sing by Delia Owens. I have head empty, no thoughts about this book. I'm just still emotionally destroyed, and I'm still trying to honestly digest what I read. It was heartbreaking in the most indifferent ways. In the most different ways that I'm not as used to in books. It is a adult fiction about a girl named Kaya who has grown up basically just by herself and had to survive in this marsh in North Carolina, and it flashes between her growing up in her life and present day 1969. So that's the present day in the story, where a boy from the town has been murdered and she has been accused of his murder, and that's basically the general premise. But if you haven't read it, just go read it. It is so good. You can tell that the author is a wildlife expert naturalist because this was just, the description of nature and the marsh in this book was just absolutely perfect. The setting was so detailed and vivid. You really felt like you were there, and it lent itself to the story so much. I think of it as like its own character in the story. I don't think I've been as invested in a single character's life this much since maybe Evelyn Hugo in The Seven Husbands of Evelyn Hugo, but I think this was even more so. I cried like I haven't cried in any other book ever. I was like hyperventilating at one point. I was sobbing so much at the end. If we could have just removed the last 10 pages, that would have been better for my emotional health, but Delia Owens decided to keep that in there, so... But I just can't believe a standalone book like this made me feel this many emotions. The only time I've like otherwise cried similarly hard is like, you know, in a long-term series where I like get really attached to characters. I have not been invested in a single character like this in so long, and that's what made everything so extra emotional. You really care so much about Kaya and her life, and I think similar to Evelyn Hugo, you feel that way because you really go through her entire life with her. You just care about her so much, and you care about the people around her so much. Delia Owens just does such a good job at making you care about the characters and the story and the plot. If you're a fan of nature, read this. If you are a fan of complex characters and extremely vivid settings, read this. If you enjoy existential crises and you enjoy staring into space for like 2 hours after finishing the book and trying to comprehend what you just read and how you're supposed to move on with your life, read it, because seriously it was really, really fun. So when I did it, it was a blast. So, but seriously, it is a mix of all good things a book can have: plot, setting, romance, character development, messaging. All of it is there, and it's so, so well done. The fact that this is her debut novel was just insane to me. But I did cry happy tears as much or even more than sad tears, so it's not all depressing the whole time, so don't think it is. It is just such an amazing story, and it's one that I really don't think I'm ever going to stop thinking about. Sometimes I say that after books and I'm like, and then by the next book I'm like, what was that? But I seriously like can't stop thinking about this book, and I think it's going to stay with me forever. This is going to be my new, I guess, like recommendation. If people like ask me for a recommendation, this is going to be my go-to. But I am putting trigger warnings up, so you can decide if this book would be okay for you. But yeah, that is all the books I read in October and November. I did have a very sad reading month. It was just everything. I feel very emotionally drained after the past 2 months, but I'm currently listening to a memoir of a comedian, so that's trying to like make me feel better, and also just another rom-com. And so hopefully I get a little bit more lightness out of my reading. But I will do a December wrap up soon and my top 10 faves of 2020. So thanks for watching. Bye!